oh, they were so intertwined economically, nobody would dare to go to war. Well, they were saying this in the 1930s as well. But also, once again, listen to what the Xi Jinping and the Chinese communists are saying, is that uh, they will absorb a lot of punishment in order to sort of rejuvenate the nation.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. China, the People's Republic of China. I welcome Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps retired. His new book, When China Attacks, A Warning to America, lays out reporting over the last 40 years that leads us to challenge right now about what is to be done. China is understood generally as an adversary. Once upon a time, China was an ally. What happened? How did we get here? Grant, a very good evening to you. Thank you very much. When China Attacks, your book suggests the attack is underway and there have already been victims in America. I go immediately to the city of Baltimore, dear to you, and you recount how it is that China attacked Baltimore and overwhelmed it and won, so much so that the latest report out of Baltimore is that it is now the highest crime rate in the country for murder and robbery, surpassing Memphis and even surpassing Detroit. How did China attack Baltimore, and what has happened to Baltimore since? Good evening to you.
Well, good evening, John. Glad to be here. With Baltimore, as I say, I use this as a sort of an example of what's happened. And how did China attack? Well, they did it without firing a shot. The assault was largely economic, for starters, and you basically took away the economic underpinnings of the city, and then you set it up and you set the whole society up for destruction. Once you've done that, particularly by, say, moving, and shutting down the big steel mills, then you leave a society that was once a vibrant sort of working class place with no options, and you set it up for drugs. And the sort of the pumping of fentanyl, just for one, into Baltimore and other big American cities, other not just big cities, little ones too, over the last decade, has murdered Americans by the hundreds of thousands. I think a few years ago, the figure was about 1,000 killed in Baltimore by fentanyl in 1 year. And that was just a few years ago. It's not gotten any better. So that's like 3 a day. And you find the fire department spend most of their time responding to drug overdoses. But you've managed to effectively destroy a society by destroying an economy and getting there's more to it, getting prominent Americans on Capitol Hill in the business class, the financial classes, who won't do anything about it because they are economically, financially, reputationally beholden to the Chinese Communist Party. So from a Chinese perspective, this is very much a form of warfare. We don't recognize it as such because no Chinese bullets are flying, but the effects have nonetheless been just as destructive as a shooting war.
The image that I like from your presentation is that once upon a time, Baltimore was a manufacturing hub for the United States of America since the beginning of the Republic. And it's gone from manufacturing products and selling to America and the world to distribution centers of products that are brought in from China. The factory floor was stolen from the people in Baltimore because of the pursuit of a lower price. The Chinese subsidize industries that undercut the manufacturing hub of Baltimore. You mentioned steel. I'm just thinking about ordinary kitchen products. All of that was out of Baltimore flowing to the East Coast no more. And the alienation and the crime followed. We could see that now, all these years later. At the time, though, there was in the United States in the late 20th century, after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, there was a belief that China was a struggling land of third world people who needed the U.S. help. We remember Tiananmen, June of 1989. That was darkness visible. That was the dragon showing his teeth. What happened after Tiananmen that we all of a sudden welcomed China into the WTO despite the fact they met none of the criteria, and that China became the attack on Baltimore. What happened in there?
Well, almost collective insanity by America's ruling class, starting with George Bush, the president, George H.W. Bush. You'll notice immediately after Tiananmen Square, he sent Brent Scowcroft and Lawrence Eagleburger, two of his prominent foreign policy guys, to Beijing with a letter. The letter is available on the internet. It is as fawning a thing as you will find. He's almost saying, I can't believe you've done this. We've got to work through this and we'll be your friends. So, what you had after that was American industry going into China in a big way. And the idea was if we help China build its economy up, it will liberalize, sort of become like a giant Canada, apparently. One of the companies I worked for, Motorola, was in fact the anchor tenant almost for that American push into China right after Tiananmen Square. And all they were ultimately doing was just committing suicide, albeit in a slow way. But this very much was conscious US government policy. And I say elite class policy is probably the better way to put it. The regular Americans were no doubt skeptical of this, and there were people on Capitol Hill who understood the risks involved, but a lot of them just didn't say anything because the donor class prevailed, and then others just weren't listened to. But as you noted, John, it just culminated in early 2000s, 2001, when China was allowed into the World Trade Organization by the United States ultimately, and despite not meeting any of the requirements for this. This was a bet that China would liberalize if it developed economically. It proved in fairly short order that this was a failing bet, yet we kept doubling down for many, many years afterwards. And this is what supercharged China's economic growth and its military growth as well. Without the economic growth, you wouldn't have a People's Liberation Army that today, in certain circumstances, could defeat the United States military.
The transformation then took place at the end of the 20th century into the 21st. I can recall reporting about the same time as the 9/11 that China was reluctant to get involved in international affairs, reluctant to participate in, say, even peacekeeping forces sponsored by the UN, held back, even held back at the UN as maybe Russia's wingman and maybe not, never voicing loudly what it wanted. Was that a false face, or was that how China perceived itself at the time, beginning of the 21st century?
Ultimately, it was a charade, a false face, as you say. The Chinese objectives have always been very clear. They've just not been able to act on them until fairly recent times. But the idea of regional domination, paying back their enemies for supposed past wrongs, and ultimately domination, called the domination of the communist system worldwide, and probably into outer space as well, if you listen to them, that has always been the objective. But as was said, I think, by Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader, bide your time, hide your capabilities, and don't show your teeth. And that's how they did it, and it worked very well. They presented this facade of a country that just wanted to make money, wanted to get rich, wasn't interested in foreign affairs, getting involved in that nasty business, had no military objectives beyond just maintaining control in the PRC. I remember actually asking the very prominent guy at the National Security Council, this would have been the early 90s. I said, what happens when China gets a navy that can operate worldwide? And he assured me that China had no interest in a blue water navy, just wouldn't happen. And that was just one example. This belief continued up until very recent times, despite manifest evidence to the contrary. So the Chinese very successfully played to what the West wanted to see and what the Americans wanted to see. And sometimes you have to step back in awe at what they accomplished. It may have looked just transparently sort of fraudulent to some of us from the beginning, but it worked. And now we're finally waking up. It is, of course, almost 30 years after we should have, but no, that's often the case.
When China attacks, a warning to America. Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps retired, is the author. It begins in the late 20th century, but here we are in the second decade and third decade of the 21st century. Xi Jinping, a man who is poorly educated, has nightmares about the Red Guards, was alienated from his family, came to America now and again, showed himself to be someone who was regarding the U.S. as a friend right before his ascension. I believe there was a trip across America in which he got very good press. However, that was then. This is now. And she is not the author, but he's the practitioner of psychological warfare. He's very good at it. So are his lieutenants. What is it that psychological warfare has done to the United States? What is Mao marketing, Grant?
Well, first for psychological warfare, and this is really a key part of all military operations, is to get the other side to do what you want him to do. And ultimately, that's what war is about, is forcing an enemy to do something, to think a certain way. And the Chinese have been very effective at this, getting the Americans for decades to think that they had to cooperate with the PRC. We have to engage with them, help the Chinese understand the rules-based order. And the idea being that we're the ones who have the problem. We're just not helping the Chinese understand it well enough. Militarily, you got the US military, the Pentagon as well, for decades to think that China posed no military threat. It either didn't have the hardware, the know-how, or it just didn't want to. China had no objectives beyond the Chinese sort of immediate boundaries. And you got people to think this, and this was the dogma. And anyone who challenged it got attacked, and at best attacked and humiliated, lost their jobs, pretty much guaranteed they'd never get promoted. And this is ultimately shaping the way your enemy thinks. And our business class really fell for this. Everybody, it seems, on Wall Street and in the sort of US Chamber of Commerce thought, well, you have to be in the China market. And that, once again, was a mantra. And nobody actually stopped to think about what the China market was actually like. But psychologically, you got Americans to think a certain way that actually happened to further Chinese interests. And that worked very well. Now, Mao marketing is a sort of an expression coined by a friend of mine who's done business in China for pretty much from the beginning. And what you do is, and what it does is it's mirroring Chinese guerrilla strategy, where remember how Mao Zedong, his idea was, dominate the countryside and then surround the cities. And it's a gradual process, and it starts but these almost innocuous things, activities. But over time, you get the target is in a position where they are helpless, vulnerable, and really can't move. And the same with business. You look how Chinese business started off, or PRC business started off. It was just small stuff. It was things that didn't really matter. They were manufacturing the umbrellas you'd put into a cocktail drink. And nobody thought much about it. But also, you look at where the Chinese have gotten involved geographically. So in terms of actually what the Chinese actually do manufacture, well, they pretty much manufacture everything. And as I said, they've gotten the Americans, the West, dependent on them to the point they've pretty much dominate and have surrounded the U.S. market. US industry and actually destroyed a lot of it because it can't compete. But the geographic part of it, there used to be something called a Yankee trader, which was Americans. You'd find them in all parts of the world selling stuff. They're extinct these days, but the Chinese are everywhere. Africa, Latin America, Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, the Chinese businessmen, from small to large, and they're everywhere. And they have, once again, seizing the countryside to dominate the cities. And if you think of the United States as the city, America is very much getting surrounded by Chinese economic attacks.
Yes, psychological warfare works so that you will all recognize these phrases. Peaceful rise. Yes. On win-win. Yes. That's psychological warfare. That's what Xi Jinping has practiced for the more than 10 years now that he's been the big boss. Important to mention, it's not meant to be in your face, but Grant has a couple of insights that are wonderful. One is the Chinese telegraph their punches. How so, Grant?
They always tell you what they're going to do. When they say they're going to teach somebody a lesson, well, at some point, stand by. When they make a threat, it may not happen tomorrow, but it will happen. When they say they are, say, going to develop a military that can protect China's overseas interests, well, you better take them seriously. Uh, Everybody laughed when the Chinese said they had laughed at the idea that the Chinese would set up a military base overseas because uh, people said, well, they don't want to. Well, they'd actually said they were going to do it. And then it took some time, but now they have a military base in Djibouti. You're going to see this played out in many other places over the years. And James Lilly, that wonderful fellow who's no longer with us, he always used to say the Chinese always telegraph their punches. And at first they try to bribe you, then they try to scare you, and after that they're stumped. We seem to forget the part about putting them into the position where they're stumped.
I like the vivid image you have of how the Mongols fought. They would slaughter many people and throw them over the walls. And you had a choice. You want to be a corpse like that, or you want to surrender. That is
But
that is that is a Chinese model from the old days.
these days, of course, all you have to do is offer sort of special treatment to
Right.
sort of a U.S. company, and that works just as well as throwing somebody a dead body over the wall. But it still works pretty well. You'll notice Xi Jinping got two standing ovations in November last year when he visited San Francisco. Standing ovations by the really U.S. business elite who had paid well to have dinner with him.
Right.
So it was a ways to go.
When China Attacks is the book, A Warning to America, Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps, retired, is the author. What is the goal? What is the mission statement for Xi Jinping, now the strong man of Asia, having extended his supremacy into a third term, unprecedented since the Maoist revolution and the death of Mao in 76? It's called Document 9. Grant tells me that it dates from right away, early days of Xi Jinping's strongman position. What does it say? What is its goal, Grant?
Well, ultimately, it describes China's main enemy, which is American ideas, Western ideas, these ideas about freedom and individual liberty, all the things that we take for granted and consider really the foundation of our systems. And he describes these as the enemy that's to be destroyed. And one of the sort of the ironic and somewhat depressing aspects of this is when she gave this speech, it was in Chinese. It didn't get much attention at all. And this was around 2013 when he had really solidified his control. And the Western press was publishing articles saying that she was really a reformer secretly. Once he got his position solidified, he was then going to ease up, and we were going to see a very different China. So while the Western media, which doesn't deserve a passing grade for its coverage of China over the years by and large, but when they're saying she's a liberator, at the same time he's giving this speech to the people that matter in China, saying this is our enemy, these Western ideas, and we are going to attack them and we're going to win.
I can remember the report early on in his time as a Supremo that the military officers, senior military officers, were told to get rid of their sports cars. I remember reporting that because it seemed so odd that they would have them to begin with and that she worried about it. I also remember him making remarks about, even if it kills me, I'm going to do this. We were wondering, what is he talking about? Is there a threat against his life? Is there coup talk? That was early days. It quickly manufactured itself into uh, a Navy, an Army, an Air Force, a Marine Corps, a Space Force, all pointed to the goal of Document 9, which is to replace the US as the supreme master of the planet, according to China. So let's go to the geography. You're very clear in your presentation that China has an advantage in the home waters inside the first island chain, especially in and around the South China Sea, which is a point of much contention because of all the shipping that flows through it. So right now they're prepared to fight inside the first island chain only, or are they building to penetrate the second island chain? Where are they in their development, Grant?
Well, they have de facto control of the South China Sea. That's been the case for about 6, 7 years now. And anytime the Americans go in to the South China Sea, yes, they can go wherever they want, but they're shadowed by Chinese ships. If the Chinese want to, they can deploy 10 ships for every one the Americans put out in there. And also, don't forget land-based and air-based anti-ship missiles from the Chinese mainland, a very close shot. The Chinese dominate it, and they can pretty much operate more or less freely within that so-called first island chain. But the Chinese are building up their hard military power in terms of ship numbers, aircraft capabilities, or just outright capabilities, and also their ability to project power, and that's to deploy force beyond your borders, well beyond globally. And they're setting up the infrastructure to do that around the world via a string of ports and airfields, allegedly for just commercial interests. But they are also giving the militaries a long-range air transports and developing a navy which is able to operate far afield as they have been doing for years in the Middle East. So they're figuring it out and gradually are being able to expand their reach. But also, when we talk about the military power, at the same time, this political power and the commercial power, which the Chinese see as just as much a weapon as the People's Liberation Army, that's everywhere. And if you look into the Pacific Islands, where Chinese political warfare, economic encroachment, and political psychological domination even has set up, you can see that they have actually gotten beyond the first island chain. But in terms of sort of sheer military power, projecting power is still a challenge for them. But play this out 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and we will see a very different China and very different Chinese military that's operating in all parts of the world.
The map, look at your maps at home. First island chain starts in Japan. It can extend to South Korea if those two countries work together. Goes through the Philippines, heads towards Indonesia. Inside that is the South China Sea. And in the South China Sea are shoals or very small islands that have been built up and fortified by the Chinese over these last 10 years of Xi Jinping's supremacy. Also, the Philippines. Look at where Subic Bay is. That was a U.S. base until it was removed in the early 90s. Were they aware of what they were doing? Did they see ahead that you were inviting the Chinese to press their advantage? I don't know, but it is suspicious. Palawan Island, see that, the shore of the South China Sea. The U.S. intends to go back to Palawan Island. We have a mutual defense pact with the Philippines. But recently, the Chinese have been probing off of Palawan Island, ramming most recently, hectoring, harassing, intimidating the Filipinos. Is that suggestive to you, Grant, that our intention to go back to Palawan Island threatens them? Is that why they're doing this?
Well, they would do it anyway, even if we weren't there. They don't like the fact that we're uh, moving back into the Philippines to a larger extent than has been the case. They don't like that, and they never like when the Americans or any neighbor does what's necessary to defend themselves. But China is constantly expanding, sort of applying pressure. and they would be doing the same thing, regardless of the Americans being there. But also, I would note that you could see what was coming as early as the late 1980s or 70s, actually, when the Chinese took some Vietnamese islands in the South China Sea, up in the northern end, and then in the 80s took some more Vietnamese territory. In the 90s, they took some Philippine islands as well. And that was after Subic Bay had been given back. So, but it's been a gradual sort of expansion. And then suddenly it really picked up speed in the 2000s into the 2010s. And as noted earlier, the Chinese telegraph their punches, but their enemy has been predisposed to believe the enemy that they call the enemy, which is us, has been predisposed to think, well, there's nothing to see here. They're not a threat. This classic threat deflation that has been going on for so many years. And while we were saying the Chinese is just a misguided sort of child who didn't know what they were doing, they were glad to have us think that. And they went on the biggest, fastest military buildup since World War II by any country, I would suggest, in human history.
Things that go boom. We'll do that very quickly. Grant writes that it's not going to be an attack on the U.S. mainland. It's not going to be Pearl Harbor. What it's going to be is Taiwan. And what does Taiwan look like? Taiwan looks like an overwhelming force, perhaps 3 divisions. Grant writes they can airlift 3 divisions and sealift 3 divisions. And then your move, USA, and that becomes the dodgy part. Are Americans going to commit themselves to blood and treasure for an island they've never visited? An island of great worth if you're making high-end chips, TSMC is there, but otherwise unknown to the United States. Japan says it will commit itself. The Philippines are participating in the understanding that they're a defensive line against China. But I believe, Grant, you believe that you make the case that within the first 24, 48 hours, there'll be calls for a ceasefire, and China's counting on that. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, I can see that sort of dynamic playing out. That if China does hit Taiwan really hard and manages to isolate it, and then quietly passes the word to the Americans, or even not so quietly, well, look, this is a domestic matter. You stay out, or it is nuclear war. It's World War III. Stay out, America. And there'll be a lot of people who don't want to stand back and let 23 million Taiwanese be enslaved. But you can imagine Wall Street and the US business class. Remember those standing ovations in San Francisco, them calling up the White House saying, we can't afford a war. This is going to upset the economy, de escalate. And that has been sort of really the mindset of most administrations until the Trump administration came along, was to de-escalate. So pressure on the US administration to just let Taiwan go quietly, yes, complain and make expressions of profound concern, but let it go. There's nothing that can be done. I can see that playing out. It doesn't have to, but it is certainly a scenario. And looking at how administrations have behaved in the past, considering the American political dynamic, I don't think that's far-fetched. We have to think through what we're going to do and to be able to respond as well. In terms of the Pearl Harbor scenario, what I would see, however, is so-called fifth column activity in the U.S., say using drones to simply go down the flight line at, say, U.S. Air Force bases and take it out. Also, you do have to wonder about all of the Chinese ships in U.S. ports, particularly given the Chinese missile in a box technology, which is putting an anti-ship missile in a shipping container, and just deploy a few of these, and you can whittle down U.S. capabilities pretty quickly with a little bit of imagination. So we have to be careful about that as well. But I think Taiwan is the likely sort of point at which a fight is going to come from a Chinese perspective. If you take Taiwan, it's very useful militarily, but think of the political effect. You have demonstrated that the United States military couldn't save 23 million people from enslavement. U.S. economic and financial pressure couldn't do it, and nuclear weapons couldn't either. I think, oh, you'd find overnight Asia turns red as everyone cuts the best deal they can with Beijing. And worldwide, people will have some real doubts about US promises of protection. So this is a very attractive target for Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party.
The book is When China Attacks. Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps, retired, is the author. The victims are already in the United States. We started with Baltimore. There are a number of cities across America, the Rust Belt, destroyed, wrecked by the Chinese plan. However, we're now coming to a battle plan, and it'll never happen, you say, especially if you've got a lot of money in the market. Well, there are reasons that you think to yourself. One is we have economic interests, and that will restrain us. But Grant, does that hold up?
No, it doesn't, and I don't think it ever has. But that's been the belief, is that, well, we were so intertwined economically, nobody would dare to go to war. Well, they were saying this in the 1930s as well. But also, once again, listen to what the Xi Jinping and the Chinese communists are saying, is that uh, they will absorb a lot of punishment in order to sort of rejuvenate the nation. And she has made some very favorable references to what China did in the Korean War, getting in, yes, yes, suffering, but it was worth it. And he's told his citizens to get ready for hardships, get ready to eat grass, is the expression they used. It's been sanctions proofing the economy so that China can absorb the economic penalties that would be applied if it goes after Taiwan. But also the entire strategy years ago was to make China completely self-sufficient economically. And the so-called Made in China 2025 policy that he was promoting a while back until people wised up to it and he changed the name, that is intended to get China so that it can withstand any pressure that may be applied if it does make a move militarily. So this is one of the beliefs, and you hear it a lot from the Wall Street and the business class, that, oh, war is just unthinkable. Well, you look at every war, and they've all been unthinkable in a certain respect. So I don't think there's much empirical evidence to suggest that this is what you want to bet the farm on.
Another idea of what will restrain war is that the Chinese Communist Party elite will stop it because they'll lose money. Does that hold up, Grant?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party elites, as the case with all Chinese or all communist elites, as they're willing to have their public absorb all sorts of punishment, all sorts of death and destruction. But when it hits them personally, then they tend to see things a little differently. But we haven't done much, if anything, ever, when it comes to a China policy that has been personal for the Chinese leadership. And that is a huge vulnerability they have, but we never exploit it. So they're willing, as I said, to a million or two people, maybe even more people get killed for what they want. They're willing to accept that, but when it affects them personally, when it affects their overseas bank accounts, their real estate, their businesses, when they stand to lose everything, then it's very different. But we have never played that card. No administration has, but it's there to be played. But I don't think that these kind of regimes really give two hoots about their own people.
Yes, you are very colorful about the rich men all having bolt holes in the United States. That's all around New York. I've seen remarks and been in neighborhoods where Chinese rich men have fled the party and are hiding on the third floor of their mansions. It's it's a colorful story. It's the beginning of a novel, but here it is. All right, another reason. The public opinion in China will stop this. They won't fight. They won't die for the Chinese Communist Party's ambition for one island. What about that, Grant?
Well, public opinion only goes so far in these kind of regimes. Uh, I think if you were to go to China and draw a mustache on a poster of Xi Jinping, uh, you'd find pretty quickly that public opinion isn't tolerated. So, as I say, I wouldn't count on that to shape the behavior of an aggressive totalitarian regime's leadership at all. So that too, I just don't see it. Yes, there's a lot of only children or one-child families that wouldn't like to see their offspring being killed in a war. They wouldn't like it. But there's at least 30 to 40 million Chinese single men who have no hope of ever finding a spouse. Well, whittling down those numbers might seem like a pretty good idea to the Chinese leadership. And also, if you make sure that the families who've lost their child uh, get a very, very good pension out of all this, there's ways to minimize the blowback from that. So once again, things that would affect a Western administration or Western society, it doesn't always apply in the case of a Chinese communist system. We tend to sort of think that they think like we do when they very much do not.
China never attacks anyone. Vietnam, 1979. India, 1962 and 2020. Nepal, conquered. Burma, conquered. Tibet, conquered. Cambodia, conquered. Khmer Rouge was tolerated. It still is, as far as I understand. So where is this idea that China never attacks anyone? What school was that, Grant?
Well, pick your Ivy League school. I don't know. It's just people believe what they want to believe about the PRC, and despite the empirical evidence of what you can see. And part of it tracks back to this psychological warfare that's been very successful by the Chinese, and in getting Americans and elites to think the way they want them to think. And
Yeah,
one
we
good
have
example.
30 seconds, Grant, 30 seconds.
And one good example that typifies everything that a lot that the Americans have done over the years was a statement by Professor Joseph Nye, who was with the Defense Department at the time. It was in the 1990s, and he said, "If we wanted to make China an enemy, treat them like one. We didn't want to do that, so we were going to treat them nicely, which means you accommodate and appease them at every step." And that is what we've done. And I've tried to sort of point out some of these things that have gotten us where we are in my book.
When China attacks, warning to America, Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps, retired, CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.